At the company awards dinner, I saw her walking in with him. The two of them side by side, as if they were a couple. She was wearing a tight black dress, the same one she wore on our 5th wedding anniversary. The boss, the man I always suspected there was something wrong with, had his hand on the middle of her back, guiding her around the room with the intimacy of someone who no longer needed to hide anything. My stomach turned. I approached her, not knowing what I was going to say, but I did. My eyes searched for an explanation. I said, in a low tone, trying to maintain my composure in front of everyone, "I looked for you everywhere, I thought you wouldn't come, and you show up here with the boss." She looked at me with that rehearsed expression, as if trying to make me believe I was exaggerating, and answered dryly, "I'm just being friendly, nothing major." At that moment, with those words sounding hollow, a certainty grew inside me, something was happening, and it had already happened long before that dinner. I didn't sleep that night. Her smile during the event, the way he looked at her, the subtle touch on her arm as they toasted, it was all an act. And I, her husband, was just an unsuspecting supporting actor, the last piece of the puzzle that had been complete for months. I started to notice the times, the excuses, the subtle changes in her perfume, her clothes, her cell phone face down on the table, the suppressed laughter when she received text messages. It was all there, but I didn't want to see it until it was too late. And it was. The shock wasn't discovering the affair. The shock was understanding the depth of the contempt with which I was treated by someone who once swore love to me. She didn't just cheat on me, she left me emotionally alone for a long time before the first kiss we exchanged. I investigated, yes. I gathered evidence. Printouts, messages, schedules, traces. And when I confronted her, there were no tears, there was no denial. There was relief. A cruel relief, like someone who finally frees themselves from the prison of marriage to experience something new, something more exciting. She looked at me as if I were the burden of her life, as if the betrayal was a consequence of my inability to make her happy. She said it was better this way. That she was confused, but that she needed this to find herself. That he made her laugh in a way I hadn't done in years. And then, she left. She chose him. But what she didn't know, and perhaps never really understood, is that her boss wasn't a man of promises. He was a man of conquest. She was just a temporary trophy in his vanity display case. A married woman, a professional challenge overcome, a diversion amidst contracts and meetings. When she separated, believing that she would finally be free to live this great love, he cooled off. He started treating her like any other. And suddenly, a new intern appeared on his radar. Younger, more innocent, easier to manipulate. The lover became a nuisance. And so he ended things with her in the most cowardly way possible, a short message on WhatsApp during a meeting. "This isn't going to work. We should each go our separate ways." And he blocked her. She broke down. She tried to call me. She tried to come to my house. She left messages on the gate. She begged, she cried, she wrote letters that read like soap operas. She said she had made a mistake. That she could see everything clearly now. That she wanted to start over. But something inside me had already died. And even though part of me still felt that raw pain of loss, I knew I could not go back. She destroyed me. She left me alone at the moment when I needed her complicity the most. When the world seemed to fall apart, she did not hold my hand, she turned her back and went to smile at another man. The most surprising thing, however, was that in the midst of the pain, I met someone. Someone who listened to me when I no longer wanted to talk. Who didn't ask about the past right away, but respected my silence. Who gradually filled the voids without rushing, without promises. Just with presence. With truth. She saw me destroyed and wasn't afraid to stay. And I, who thought it was impossible to love again, was being rebuilt by the simple gestures of someone who only wanted to see me well. When my ex-wife came back, begging for a chance, offering me everything she once refused to give me, I was no longer the same man. And she was no longer the one I wanted by my side. She watched from afar the life that could have been hers. She tried to manipulate, to use our history, our memories, our daughter's name. But it was no use. I had already left where she left me. And the cruelest thing of all, and perhaps her true punishment, was to realize that the love she had scorned had blossomed in another heart. In someone who arrived slowly, without promises, but with truth. And while she cried, alone, the man she had lost began again. But what no one ever knew, is what I really found in that investigation. Because before everything went downhill, before she even knew I suspected anything, I discovered something. Something I kept to myself. A hidden detail, a silent truth that she never wanted revealed. And that secret, that one secret, was what gave me the strength to close the door forever. A detail that changed the entire way I saw our story. A piece of information that, if she knew I had discovered, she might never be able to sleep peacefully again. After all, there is something even worse than being betrayed, is realizing that you have been deceived completely. Even in the smallest things. And that's where it all begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. All stories are fictional, but based on real situations that show, without filters, how infidelity can destroy homes, families, and souls. Our goal is to leave a clear message: cheating is never worth it. Now get ready to dive into another intense story, full of twists and turns and consequences. Take a deep breath, because what comes next is shocking. Jonathan has always been a man of restrained gestures and an intense heart. He grew up in a simple family, where love was taught more by example than by words. He learned from his father that respecting a woman was the basis of any relationship, and from his mother that caring was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. When he met Helena, he felt as if everything finally made sense. She was confident, determined, full of life. She had a sparkle in her eyes that seemed to transform any environment into something welcoming. He, on the other hand, was more reserved, observant, the type who preferred to listen first and talk later. They balanced each other out, like two sides of the same cord. They complemented each other in the details. What he lacked, she provided. What she couldn't handle, he supported. That's why their marriage seemed, in everyone's eyes, a solid union, the kind that inspires other couples to believe that love, when true, resists everything. Helena was an ambitious woman in the most honest sense of the word. She worked in the administrative area of a multinational company and, over the years, she climbed the ladder step by step with great effort and intelligence. It was not uncommon to see her arriving home with folders in her hands, still talking about a project or a goal that had been surpassed. Jonathan admired this dedication. While he worked as an architect in a medium-sized firm, with more flexible hours, she lived between deadlines and meetings. But even with their busy routines, the two sought to maintain a connection. They had created silent rituals that brought them together: breakfast on Saturdays on the balcony of their apartment, improvised dinners during the week with cheap wine and soft music, trips at the end of the year to destinations that were not very touristy but full of meaning. It was at these times that their love grew even stronger, like roots that grow invisibly under the ground, strong even when the winds blow. In the early years of their marriage, their passion was intense and unpretentious. Touch, desire, affection, everything seemed to come naturally, as if it were impossible not to want to be close to each other. Later, as is common in many long-term relationships, this passion changed. It didn't disappear, but it settled down, exchanging intensity for depth. They began to value other types of intimacy: the comfort of sharing silence, the pleasure of knowing each other's taste in small things, like their favorite way to fold towels or which pillow to use. There was love, and there was peace. And that seemed to be enough. Jonathan, by nature, was faithful to his principles. He had no eyes for anyone else. Helena's beauty still impressed him, even after almost a decade together. Her smile when she woke up, the way she fixed her hair after a shower, her spontaneous laugh when she watched something silly, all of this still made him fall in love every day. He saw her as his life partner, his companion at all times, and he believed, without reservations, that the feeling was mutual. Helena, on the other hand, faced greater pressure at work as she moved up the ranks. She had become a project manager, responsible for leading teams, making strategic decisions, and presenting results. It was a respectful position, but also a lonely one. She felt that the more she advanced, the more she needed to protect herself, be firm, even tough at times. And this armor she wore at work, without realizing it, began to creep into her home as well. She no longer had as much patience for details, slow conversations, and small rituals. Jonathan noticed, but attributed it to fatigue. He tried to compensate with gestures. He would prepare dinner, leave notes in her bag, put flowers in the bathroom at the end of a difficult week. He wanted her to know that he was there, that she could take off her armor when she got home. And sometimes she did. But at other times, she seemed more distant, as if she were living in a parallel reality that he could not fully access. They didn't fight. There was no shouting, no insults, no slamming of doors. But there were silences. There were conversations that never started. There were glances that didn't meet. And yet, there was love. Or at least, Jonathan believed there was. He trusted her, he trusted the years of history, the amount they had built together. They had friends in common, memories scattered around the city, paintings she had painted in the living room, books he had marked in the bedroom, smells mixed in the closets, songs with unique meanings in their playlists. It was more than a marriage, it was a life sewn together stitch by stitch, like a quilt made with patience and dedication. And even on the coldest days, that quilt warmed them. Jonathan was never one to be suspicious. He believed that true love didn't need distrust, that respect was the basis of everything. And Helena always showed herself to be committed, present on important dates, affectionate with his family, involved in household matters. She was practical, yes, but she was also kind. It was hard to imagine that behind that determined gaze there was any kind of deviation. He knew her, he thought. He knew her tastes, her fears, her dreams. And she, by her side, knew how honest he was, how he would never hide anything from her. They had built a solid home, and even though the routine sometimes consumed them, there was the certainty that they were on the same side. In Helena's workplace, the dynamics were different. Competitiveness, forced smiles, tense meetings, unattainable goals. There, the games were subtle but constant. The boss, a charismatic and experienced man, with a history of good results and a solid reputation within the company, knew exactly how to deal with his subordinates. He praised in the right measure, knew how to delegate accurately and created almost personal bonds with those he wanted to keep close. Helena, being an outstanding professional, naturally entered his radar. Over time, they began to exchange quick confidences between one task and another, discreet jokes in the elevator, long glances in meetings. Nothing that strayed from protocol, but also nothing that went unnoticed. Colleagues commented, some out of envy, others out of distrust. But Helena knew how to behave. She remained firm, impersonal. Jonathan, in turn, never knew about these nuances. He continued to live his routine with the calm certainty that everything was fine. He was making plans for a trip at the end of the year, organizing payments for the bathroom renovation, and thinking about surprising Helena with a weekend at a charming inn in the countryside, just the two of them. He felt that they needed to reconnect, and since he had always been the more sensitive one in the relationship, he decided to take the initiative. He was a practical man, but also emotionally attentive. He noticed the distance, the tiredness in her eyes, and instead of closing himself off, he opened up even more. He wanted to reclaim what had always kept them together. Helena, however, had other concerns. She was involved in a new project, with tight deadlines and intense demands. The time they spent together was decreasing without them realizing it. And even when they were in the same house, they seemed to be worlds apart. One watching television in the living room, the other finishing reports on the computer in the bedroom. One preparing dinner, the other responding to emails. Small disagreements that, day after day, created chasms. But there were no arguments. Jonathan didn't demand anything, and Helena clung to the idea that they were just going through a difficult phase. And difficult phases pass. At least that's what she told herself. The invitation to the company's awards dinner came as a celebration. Helena had stood out and would be mentioned among the names of the year. Jonathan was proud. He planned his outfit carefully, chose a tie that she herself had given him some time ago, and waited anxiously for her at the door of the event hall. She, however, had already entered. And what happened there, in that moment when their eyes met from a distance, was just the beginning of something that would change everyone's lives forever. But, until then, nothing had been said. No truth revealed. Just an unsettling feeling, a spark that had not yet exploded, but that was already filling the air with a charge. Jonathan didn't know. Not yet. And Helena, no matter how well she hid it, also didn't know that certain choices, no matter how small they may seem, are capable of rewriting entire destinies. They were still together. But, within the silence, time was already working against them. And deep down, the heart of one of them had already started to look in another direction. The week after the awards dinner, something changed almost imperceptibly. Jonathan felt it, but he couldn't name it. It was like a slight mismatch, a rhythm that had once been harmonious and now became out of tune in small moments of daily life. Helena seemed even more absent, but her smile was lighter, more relaxed, as if she were somewhere else, breathing a different kind of air. He noticed it when she came home late and carelessly left her bag on the couch, or when she talked about work with a sparkle in her eyes that hadn't been there for months. She was different. More vain, more confident, as if she had rediscovered a part of herself that had been dormant. Jonathan, out of love, tried to convince himself that it was just a new professional cycle, that her enthusiasm was the result of the achievements she had been accumulating. He wanted to believe that. He wanted, with all his might, for that to be all. In the following days, he began to prepare a surprise. He booked a cozy inn a few hours away, chose the most isolated and quiet cabin, thought of everything down to the smallest detail, the wine she liked, the books they could read together, even a handkerchief embroidered with her name to leave on the pillow. He needed to reconnect them, he needed to bring her back. Not because she was physically distant, but because her gaze seemed to be in another universe. Jonathan was a sensitive man, but not naive. He sensed when something was slipping through the cracks in the relationship, even if he didn't know exactly what it was. Her presence became increasingly intermittent. Her responses came automatically, conversations lost depth, and gestures of affection became rare. When he approached, she moved away, as if there was always something urgent waiting for her somewhere else. Helena, at that time, lived in an intense duality. During the day, she was the exemplary professional, focused, determined. But inside, something pulsed with an unexpected force. Her boss, with whom she had previously maintained a strictly formal relationship, began to occupy an emotional space that she could no longer ignore. It began with long conversations in the hallways, then exchanges of messages outside of work hours, until lunches for the two of them became frequent. It was an attraction that built slowly, fed by the silences between one sentence and the next, by the accidental touch of a hand when passing on a report, by the subtle compliments that became routine. Helena knew that this was dangerous. He knew that he was crossing invisible lines that, once crossed, would be difficult to go back. But there was a desire there, an excitement that she had not felt for a long time. And somehow it made her feel alive. Jonathan noticed that her cell phone was on silent all the time. That she smiled to herself while typing, that the perfume she used to wear only on special occasions was now part of her daily life. He tried to ignore it, tried not to think too much about it. Until, one night, she said she would be working late, and he decided to do something unexpected. He brought her dinner, he wanted to surprise her, to show her that they were still together even in the midst of the chaos. He arrived at the company building, asked to go up, but was told that she had already left. He tried to call, without success. He returned home with the untouched dinner, left the food in the fridge and sat in silence on the couch, staring into the void as if trying to foresee a disaster. And that morning, while she slept soundly beside him, he wondered for the first time if he was alone in that relationship. The following days were spent observing. Jonathan became more attentive, more introspective. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed, the way she avoided eye contact, how she changed the subject when he mentioned the weekend at the inn, how her tone of voice wavered when she talked about work. Until one afternoon, she left her unlocked cell phone on the table. Jonathan was not the type of man to spy, he had never done that before. But that day, there was something inside him that could no longer bear the weight of doubt. He read the messages. And, in the face of the words exchanged between her and her boss, the ground beneath his feet ceased to exist. There were scheduled meetings, intimate conversations, subtle promises and open desires. There was no more room for assumptions. It was real. And it was cruel. He didn't react immediately. He didn't yell, he didn't break anything, he didn't confront her that night. He just watched her sleep, like he had so many times before, and he felt a chasm grow between them. He knew he needed time. He knew he needed to figure out what to do with that pain that kept growing. The next day, Helena woke up and left for work without noticing anything different. Jonathan stayed home. He spent the day replaying their entire relationship in his head, remembering the smiles, the trips, the birthdays, every gesture of love that now seemed like a misplaced piece in a puzzle that no longer made sense. He tried to find where everything started to fall apart, where he was no longer enough, where love was replaced by adrenaline. But there were no clear answers. There was only the hurt. And the silence. He didn't say anything during that week. He kept up his routine, but little by little, he began to distance himself emotionally. His messages became shorter, his looks more empty. Helena, too wrapped up in her own illusion, took a while to realize. She thought she was in control of the situation, that she was just trying something new without compromising the structure of her marriage. But what she didn't know was that Jonathan had already distanced himself irreversibly. He kept every word, every screenshot, every feeling inside him. And it was during that period that he began to change. He started going out more by himself, meeting old friends, and resuming projects that he had put aside. And, in the midst of one of these new experiences, he met someone. A woman who listened to him attentively, who laughed at his stories, who made him feel seen again. He wasn't ready for anything, but the lightness of that encounter made him breathe again. Meanwhile, the affair between Helena and her boss was growing more intense. Their meetings became more frequent, their touches more intimate, and the boundaries had been completely erased. She believed that she could take everything without losing anything, that it was possible to live two parallel stories without one interfering with the other. But Jonathan's gaze, increasingly distant, began to bother her. He tried to reconnect, prepared dinner, suggested a trip. He went, but he was no longer present. He was there only in body. His mind had crossed a portal of no return. And when she realized this, she felt a discomfort that she could not name. As if something was slipping through her fingers and she no longer knew how to contain it. The following week, Jonathan announced that he would be traveling alone. He said he needed some time to think, to reorganize himself. Helena accepted, perhaps with a disguised relief, as if this time away would give her more freedom. Her boss, for his part, was already showing signs of impatience. He began to avoid meeting people outside of work, responding coldly, saying he was busy. Helena tried to insist, but he dodged her. She didn't know it, but he was already interested in someone else. Younger, recently hired, impressionable. Someone who didn't demand anything yet, who he just admired in silence. Helena then began to realize that she was alone in this story. And when that became clear, she panicked. She tried to call Jonathan, but he didn't answer. She texted him, and he gave her short replies. He was somewhere else, physically and emotionally. And it was in that moment of sudden loneliness that she felt the fall. Her boss was no longer her safe haven, and her husband seemed unattainable. The game that had seemed under her control was now a ruin. And when she returned home one night, she found the apartment showing clear signs of change. Jonathan had taken some of his things. There were no more shirts in the closet, no shoes in the hallway, no smell of him on the pillows. Just a letter on the table. There was no anger, no shouting, no accusations. There was pain. A silent pain, written in firm and tender words, like everything he had ever been. He said he knew everything. That he didn't hate her. That he had simply understood that he could no longer live where he was no longer loved. And that he hoped, with all his heart, that she would be happy, even if it wasn't with him. Helena sat on the living room floor and cried like she had never cried before. And in that cry, she realized that she had lost what mattered most. Not by accident. But by choice. And what she didn't know yet was that Jonathan, even though he was torn apart inside, was keeping a secret. One last detail that, when revealed, would change everything. Absolutely everything. On the afternoon that Helena, for the first time in weeks, decided to look for Jonathan in person, he was no longer in the apartment. The keys had been left with the doorman, along with a sealed envelope in his firm handwriting. Inside, there was no request for an explanation, no direct accusation, just the warning that he had moved on. There was no new address, no return date. The emptiness of that response, even wrapped in polite words, echoed inside her like a scream. In Jonathan's absence, everything that had previously been ignored began to hurt. The clothes he wore, now missing from the closet, the books with the spines marked in the exact place where he had stopped reading, the worn slippers left under the bed. It was as if everything had been carefully removed so as not to leave a trace, but even so his absence filled every corner. And it was only when she realized that he had in fact left that something inside her broke violently. Her boss, now distant and indifferent, did not respond to her messages. The new employee was already smiling at meetings, sitting too close, speaking too softly, laughing too loudly. Helena now understood that she hadn't been special, just useful. And it was eating her up inside. It was on a rainy afternoon, weeks after the last failed attempt to contact him, that she saw his name appear again, this time on her cell phone screen, with an unexpected message. A dry, direct invitation, but loaded with something she couldn't name, tomorrow, at 7 p.m., at the café on the corner of Rua do Teatro. Only come if you're willing to listen until the end. Her heart raced, her breathing quickened. She almost answered immediately, but there was no question in the message. It was a call. And she, even overcome by anxiety, knew she couldn't refuse. She arrived early, wearing the same coat she had on the day they met, as an unconscious gesture of trying to reconnect with who she had been before everything fell apart. She asked for tea, but didn't touch the cup. When Jonathan came in, he wasn't the man she remembered. He was thinner, his gaze firmer, his expression calm but unapproachable. He sat down without kissing her cheek, without smiling, without apologizing. He just stared at her, like someone measuring the depth of an abyss. She tried to start, to say that she was sorry, that things had gotten out of control, that she regretted it, that nothing made sense without him anymore. But he raised his hand, asking for silence. He said that she would have the chance to speak, but first, he needed to say something. And then, he took a deep breath, looked into her eyes as if he had been carrying a weight for a long time, and began. He said that on the night of the awards dinner, when he saw her with her boss, something broke inside him. But what she didn't know, and perhaps never suspected, is that he had already known everything before that night. He said he had discovered the affair 2 weeks earlier, by chance, when he saw a notification appear on her cell phone screen. Not a message, but a calendar reminder, dinner with him, hotel booked. He said he didn't confront her because he needed to understand what he felt. He needed to observe. And it was in that silence that he saw the woman he married disappear. And more than the pain of betrayal, what hurt him was the realization that she had chosen to lie even when she could have told the truth. But that wasn't what hurt him the most. It was what came after. And that was what he wanted to talk about now. In a lower voice, almost a whisper, Jonathan revealed that Helena's boss, the man she had risked everything for, had already tried to get involved with another employee at the company months before. An employee who, coincidentally, was the sister of a close friend of his. He said that this woman had been fired, without formal justification, after refusing his advances. And that, upon learning this, Jonathan began to connect the dots. He discreetly sought out this woman, listened to what she had to say. She told him about the manipulation, the exaggerated compliments, the invitations to informal meetings at coffee shops after work hours, about how he used his power to charm and then discard. Jonathan said that, at that moment, he knew that this was not just marital betrayal. It was a repeat. A trap. And Helena had fallen for it. But that wasn't the secret. He said that, after discovering the betrayal and hearing the story of the other employee, he decided to contact the company's legal department, using a connection he had through a former client. He asked for discretion. And he discovered that Helena's boss was being investigated internally, not by one, but by 3 previous reports of harassment and inappropriate behavior. Nothing had been made public yet. It was a silent, strategic process to preserve the company's image. Helena, at that time, did not know that she was also being watched. Jonathan knew everything before she even received the warning. And that was where the story became cruel. He looked her in the eye and firmly told her that he knew that when she was promoted, it wasn't just on merit. That there were records. That there was a video. That, no matter how much control she thought there was, her boss had left traces. And the company had already decided his fate and that of everyone involved. She would be called to testify. She could deny it, of course. She could try to protect her reputation. But it was too late. Jonathan said that in the documents he had access to, her name appeared as someone who knew of the man's reputation and yet accepted getting involved. It was collusion. And in a high-level corporate environment, that would be enough to end an entire career. He said he didn't expose her. That he would never report her directly. But that he didn't need to, she put herself in that position. And he only found out about all this because, in trying to understand why he was being cheated on, he delved into a labyrinth of truths that she never imagined could come to light. Helena remained silent. Her eyes wide, her hand trembling over the still full cup. She tried to formulate a response, but there were no words. She understood that it wasn't just about him and her. It was about everything she had risked for something that was nothing more than vanity and unresolved need. She tried to hold his hand, but he pulled away with a restrained gesture. He said that he was with someone else now. That he wasn't looking for revenge, but peace. That this conversation was the last bridge he needed to burn in order to move on. And that he hoped that, somehow, she would find the same path. But alone. Helena cried. Not with scandalous tears, but with a pain that came from deep within. A silent and dense pain, of someone who finds herself naked before her choices. Jonathan stood up, placed an exact amount on the table, looked at her one last time and left. And, in that moment, she knew that she had lost everything. And the most devastating thing was knowing that, this time, there would be no going back. The cafe remained silent. The yellow lights were no longer warm. And there, in that cold chair, Helena stared at the bottom of the cup and the emptiness of herself. Because, in the end, it wasn't her lover who destroyed her. It was the lie. The choice. And now, she would have to learn to live with the echo of what she let slip. The day after the meeting at the cafe, Helena woke up without the strength to get out of bed. The pillow still smelled faintly of Jonathan's perfume, a discreet, woody fragrance that had filled the room with familiarity for years. But now, that same smell burned. It was a cruel reminder of absence. She spent hours motionless, staring at the ceiling, trying to comprehend the extent of what she had lost. The fall was not just emotional or marital. It was professional, personal, moral. What Jonathan had revealed was not just the exposure of an intimate betrayal, but the dismantling of the entire structure she believed she had built with competence and autonomy. Knowing that the boss she had gotten involved with had a history of harassment, that the company was silently investigating the relationships he established with his subordinates, and that she was now part of this plot like a disposable piece, made her sick. Helena was not naive, but she was not cynical either. He had always been proud of the path he had walked with effort. Now, the possibility that her conquests would be seen as the result of favors or involvements made everything dirty, unbearable. The messages, the meetings, the touches, everything that before she forced herself to see as a connection, now revealed itself entirely as a sordid game in which she had been just another predictable player. For the next few days, she didn't leave the house. She ignored calls from work and refused messages from the few friends she still kept in touch with. The apartment, once silent out of comfort, was now unbearably silent. The walls seemed to be watching her. The kitchen, which she had previously avoided out of sheer laziness, now became a symbol of abandonment. She even picked up her cell phone to call Jonathan, but her hands were shaking and her voice was breaking before she even heard the first ring. His name on the screen seemed untouchable, unreachable, like a memory of a world that was no longer hers. The woman looking at herself in the mirror was now a stranger. And the worst part was that, for the first time, she felt ashamed not of what others would think, but of what she herself had allowed. The notion that everything could have been avoided, that she had had chances to say no, to back down, to protect what she had, corroded her conscience in slow, painful layers. It was in this state of confusion that, on a cloudy morning, she received the much-feared official summons from the company. A formal email, just a few lines long, summoning her to a meeting with the compliance department. No detailed explanation. No chance to claim ignorance. The message was straightforward: attendance was mandatory. Her heart raced, her mouth went dry, her hands tingled. Everything Jonathan had said was coming true with frightening precision. On the day of the meeting, she wore the most neutral outfit she had, tied her hair tightly, and wore light makeup. She tried to maintain an appearance of control, even when everything in her body screamed otherwise. She arrived at the company with measured steps, looking away from her colleagues, as if everyone knew, as if every face carried judgment. When she entered the meeting room, 3 people were waiting for her. No expression of welcome. Just papers, folders, and a recorder on the table. The conversation was tougher than she expected. They showed records, printouts, calendar movements, and excerpts of conversations taken from the company's servers. No innuendo. Everything was documented. She tried to explain herself, saying that she never imagined he would be capable of using his position to manipulate so many women, that she believed there was, indeed, a mutual involvement, but never based on power or interest. But the expressions on the other side of the table did not change. At the end of the meeting, she was informed that her dismissal would be immediate. Without prejudice, but definitive. A formal statement would be written for the team, and her name would not be mentioned directly, but it would be implied. Helena left there in a state of shock. She walked aimlessly through the streets, until she realized that she had gotten on the subway without even realizing where she was going. The world around her seemed to move on a different frequency, as if she were immersed in a bubble of guilt and loss that prevented her from breathing. And it was in this trance that she picked up her cell phone and wrote to Jonathan. A long, emotional, sincere text. For the first time, she did not ask to come back. She simply told him everything. She told him about the meeting, about the veiled humiliation, about the fear of never finding herself again. She said that she did not expect forgiveness, but needed him to know that the regret was real. That the pain of losing herself was worse than any separation. Jonathan read the message that night, in silence. He was in Camilla's apartment, the woman with whom he was beginning to build something new, light, healthy. A type of relationship he didn't even know he could still have. Camilla noticed his expression change as he read the text, but she didn't ask. Jonathan just got up, went to the balcony and took a deep breath. He felt compassion. But there was no more hurt, no desire to return. The love he once felt for Helena was now a scar, visible, but already healed. A few days later, they decided to meet one last time. A mutual agreement, no promises. Just closure. They chose an open park, where they could walk without having to hold a table between them. Helena arrived punctually. Jonathan, a little later. Both different, marked, but more serene than before. They walked for a few minutes in silence, until she spoke. She said she had tried to understand what led her to make so many bad decisions, that she spent nights reliving each moment. She talked about how she felt used, how she realized too late that what she thought was freedom was just an escape. Jonathan listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished, he simply said that he forgave. But that forgiving didn't mean forgetting, nor did it mean accepting back. It was just a way of freeing them both. He said that he was following a different path now. That he had found joy in small things again and that Camila had shown him that it was possible to love again without fear. Helena smiled, with tears in her eyes. She said that she was happy for him, even if it hurt. Jonathan held her hand for a moment. Not with desire, nor with longing. Just with humanity. Then he let go. And that gesture, simple and symbolic, sealed the end. They both went in opposite directions in the park. And in that slow separation, she knew that the love she had lost would never return. But she also understood that some losses are necessary for one to see oneself clearly. She didn't know how she would rebuild her life. But for the first time in months, she was sure that she wouldn't do it again by trying to find Jonathan. Now, she would have to find herself alone. He, in turn, returned home and found Camila reading on the couch. He sat down next to her, stroked her hair, and for the first time, he felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. There was no more noise. There was no more past holding his steps. There was peace. And that was all he needed. Time followed its course with an almost surgical coldness, not caring about the recent scars or what still hurt in each of them. The separation did not make headlines or become a scandal, there were no public fights or legal disputes, just the discreet dissolution of a story that had been too deep to end with shouting. Jonathan resumed his routine with more clarity, now less attached to the past and more attentive to what he had been building, albeit silently. The days began to take on new meaning, not because of forgetfulness, but because they were finally no longer tied to the same memories. He now walked down streets where he had once walked with Helena without the weight of comparisons, went into cafes where he had once sat with her and was able to taste the coffee without each sip bringing a bitter taste of nostalgia. It was as if he was relearning to live in spaces that had once belonged to the two of them, but that now belonged only to him once again. Camila did not invade his life with urgency, but with respect. He never asked more questions than necessary, never forced his presence in places where there were still shadows. She understood that Jonathan was going through a painful process, and this sensitivity was what gradually made him open up again. Together, they built a serene relationship, far from drama, but full of small charms that only exist when there is truth. Jonathan sometimes still thought about everything that happened, not with resentment, but with the detachment of someone who observes a closed wound. He knew that he had learned hard lessons and that perhaps it had been necessary to go through that to find himself again. Even in the happiest moments with Camila, he never pretended that he had no history. And this made each gesture he offered now have more value, because it was a choice, not a habit, it was awareness, not convention. Meanwhile, Helena was still going through the desert of herself. The loss of her job was only the beginning of a process of internal implosion. Her social circles began to dissolve, the messages decreased, the invitations stopped. She became a strange figure among her acquaintances, someone who was spoken about in low tones, with a mixture of pity and judgment. She tried to start new projects, looked for agencies, updated her resume, but the responses were scarce. Her reputation, even without being officially tarnished, seemed to always be ahead of her, paving the way for suspicious looks. The interviews seemed like moral tests disguised as technical questions. She noticed the hesitation in the recruiter's eyes, as if they saw something in her that not even she could explain clearly. She spent her days indoors, mostly in silence, immersed in constant self-analysis. She thought about the choices, the triggers, the vanity that she so often confused with freedom. Her closest friends had drifted away over time, not out of malice, but because she had isolated herself. She rejected advice, ignored warnings, and pushed away those who tried to warn her. Now, she even missed the conversations she had previously thought were trivial. She called her mother one late afternoon, after weeks of no contact, just to hear her voice. She didn't tell her everything. She couldn't. But she cried during the call, and her mother, even without understanding the details, offered the silence that only unconditional love can offer. The call ended with a promise to visit her that she knew she would postpone. She wasn't yet ready to look into the eyes of someone who had always seen her as an example. First, she needed to be able to look at herself with a minimum of respect. She tried to go back to therapy, but in the first few sessions she only cried. The words wouldn't come. It was as if everything was bottled up, waiting for the right moment to come out. The dilemma that was eating away at her was not just regret. It was the difficulty of accepting that she had become someone she despised. For years, she had condemned similar stories, pointed fingers at women who had put their relationships and careers at risk on impulse. Now, she was the one who needed to look in the mirror and face the version of herself that had chosen the easiest path, the most seductive, and also the most destructive. She began to write, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. The words began timidly, fragmented, but little by little they formed entire paragraphs, as if they had been hidden, waiting for her to have the courage to face them. He told his own story with painful sincerity, without embellishments, without apologies. He wrote for himself, but also because perhaps, one day, he could use it to warn someone, or simply to understand where everything began to fall apart. It was a slow process, like rebuilding a house on the ruins without taking your eyes off the destruction. Jonathan, on the other hand, continued to rediscover love in a serene way. Camila was different in many ways, but perhaps the most important thing was that she didn't demand it, she just accompanied him. They started taking short trips, not to forget the past, but to create new memories. On one of these getaways, he took Camila to the same cabin he had booked one day to go with Helena. She didn't know. But when he saw the room, he had a brief silence that she respected. That night, he told her part of the story, not to cause pain, but to share a piece of himself. Camila listened attentively and simply said that she was there, and that time was different now. Jonathan felt relieved. It was as if he was finally at peace with what he had been through. The nights with her were peaceful, without the anguish of before. And that, more than any revenge, was his greatest victory. Meanwhile, Helena received an offer to work at an NGO focused on supporting women in situations of abuse at work. The salary was lower, as was the position, but she accepted. Not because there were no other options, but because there was something symbolic about that choice. It was a way of giving back to the world part of what she had let slip away. At first, she felt out of place, like an imposter. But little by little, she began to find meaning. She began to give internal lectures, helped with the triage of cases, and listened to stories that were so similar to her own that they made her shudder. In those conversations, she met women like her, lost between guilt and desire, between strength and fragility. And there, in that space where no one judged her, she began to understand that there was still a way. Not to go back to being who she was, but to become someone new. One day, without planning it, the two crossed paths. It was at a charity event organized by a network of companies that supported social projects. Jonathan was there as a guest architect to present a proposal for renovations to one of the NGO spaces. Camila was by his side, holding a folder with sketches. Helena was in the auditorium, preparing to present a panel on ethics and safety in the corporate environment. When their eyes met, there was no anger, no pain, no hurt. Just recognition. They both smiled, discreetly. A small smile, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning. He walked up to her during the break, said a brief, "Nice to see you," and she responded with a, "You too." They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. That same day, as he was driving home with Camila, Jonathan looked out the car window and smiled to himself. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of relief. He had made peace with the past. He was sure that everything he had experienced had led him there. And although the path had been difficult, he could now breathe without the weight on his chest. Helena, on the other side of the city, took off her shoes when she got home, sat down at the table, opened the notebook where she wrote her memories and wrote another page. Not with pain, but with gratitude. For the chance to continue, even after everything. And for the first time, he felt that perhaps he was at the beginning of something that he still couldn't name, but that was no longer born of guilt, but of truth. The invitation to the charity event was just the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved. After the brief reunion with Helena, Jonathan didn't bring up the subject again. Life with Camila had taken on a mature and solid shape, far from the euphoria and intensity that had marked his previous relationship. With Camila, there was depth, but there was also lightness. There was no need to prove anything, there was no need to conquer territory that already belonged to her every day. She knew her silences and respected her pauses, and it was in this space that love was built silently but firmly. Jonathan was now involved in a new project, a partnership between his office and a network of NGOs focused on rebuilding community spaces. It was more than work. It was a purpose. Redesigning places of shelter, transforming spaces where vulnerable women could restart their stories, in a safe and dignified way. He never told anyone this, but the first project was inspired by the letters that Helena had left on the table at the end of everything. He had reread them months later, in a moment of solitary reflection, and there, among the broken and regretful words, he had found the outline of a woman being reconstructed. It had left a deeper impression on him than he would have liked to admit. Camila was aware of these movements wisely. She knew that Jonathan was a man made of layers, of dense stories that still vibrated inside. And instead of trying to erase his past, she decided to become part of the present with presence and constancy. She also carried her own ghosts, and perhaps that was why she never asked him to pretend to be a clean-cut man. Between them, there was no rush. There was listening. There was truth. One day, while they were preparing dinner together, Camila asked him what he had felt when he saw Helena at the event. Jonathan was washing the vegetables when he heard the question. He stopped, thought for a moment, and said sincerely that he had felt peace. Not longing. Not desire. Just an honest understanding that that story, despite everything, had made him grow. Camila smiled, said nothing. She just rested her head on his shoulder and they continued cooking in silence. On the other side of the city, Helena was beginning to experience a routine without emotional urgencies for the first time. Her work at the NGO was intensifying, and although her wounds still bled at times, she felt useful. She was sought out by women who saw her not as a heroine, but as someone real, who had failed and still chose to follow. One morning, during a workshop on harassment and corporate boundaries, a young professional asked to talk after the presentation. They went to a nearby coffee shop and, between coffees and knowing glances, the young woman told her that she was having an affair with her direct superior. She said that she knew it was wrong, but that she had gotten emotionally involved, that she felt guilt and pleasure at the same time, that she was lost. Helena listened to everything without interrupting. And when it was her turn to speak, he didn't use any self-help formula. He simply told her story, raw, with flaws, without holding back. The young woman cried. She said that no one had ever been so honest with her. And in that moment, Helena realized that no matter how much her path had been marked by mistakes, she now served a purpose. And that gave her meaning. The weeks went by, and with them came subtle changes. Helena started attending creative writing classes on Saturdays. She began organizing a small support group for women who, like her, had been involved in abusive relationships disguised as romance. She read more, listened to more music, and went back to caring for the plants she had let die years ago. She still lived alone, but now her silence was no longer loneliness, it was a pause. A necessary space to rebuild her voice. It was on one of these writing afternoons that, unexpectedly, she received an email from the editor of a social content portal. She had read one of her texts shared by one of the NGO's assistants and was interested in publishing a series of chronicles based on real experiences. Helena hesitated. Her name was still sensitive. There were those who remembered the story, the behind-the-scenes, the rumors. But she decided to accept. Not to promote herself, but because she needed to transform the pain into something that would not fester inside her. She wrote about guilt, about power, about desire and consent. And the readings exploded. The comments were emotional, many anonymous, thanking someone for having the courage to admit what so many live and hide. This did not erase the past, but it gave it a new value. Jonathan read one of these texts by chance. It wasn't signed with her full name, but he recognized the writing. He read it carefully, with respect, at the right distance. He felt proud. Not the pride of someone who supports one team, but of someone who recognizes the courage in the other. He didn't share it, didn't comment, didn't send a message. He just kept it as further proof that sometimes, even what breaks can become the basis for something new. That same night, while walking with Camila along the edge of the dam, he told her that he had read a text by someone important from his past. Camila held his hand and said that she hoped that person had finally forgiven himself. Jonathan replied that he thought so. And in that gesture, the past found a definitive resting place. Jonathan's new architectural project took him on a trip to the south, where he would oversee the construction of an emergency shelter. Camila was unable to accompany him due to commitments with her own company, but she remained in constant contact. Jonathan traveled alone for the first time since the separation. During the hours on the road, he reflected on everything he had experienced in the last 2 years. About how betrayals can destroy entire structures, but also reveal the foundations that were never solid. He thought about how many times he had tried to save a marriage alone, how he had blamed himself for signs he chose to ignore, how he had loved to the point of being unbearable. And now, as he drove through the mountains, he felt a kind of lightness that only comes to those who finally understand that love, to be real, needs to be shared with the same intensity. Helena, in turn, was invited to give a talk at a national conference on business ethics and interpersonal relationships in the corporate environment. It was the first time she would speak to such a large audience. She prepared for weeks, writing and rewriting her speech countless times. On the big day, she dressed in simple elegance and took the stage with the posture of someone who carries on her shoulders the pain of a past and the responsibility of warning so that it does not happen again. When she finished, she received a standing ovation. Many did not know her personal story, but they felt the strength of the speaker. Some did know. And they applauded even more for it. In the audience, a woman was crying quietly. At the end of the talk, she went to Helena and said that she had read all of her chronicles. That she had also been involved with a manipulative boss. That she had lost her job, her fiancé, and almost herself. But that thanks to the texts, she found the courage to get out of that situation. Helena hugged her, and in that hug she understood that she had crossed over to the other side. That her pain was no longer a wound, it was a scar. And that scars, even ugly ones, tell stories that save other people. That night, she went home and wrote until dawn. Not out of obligation, but because she had finally found her own voice again. Not an idealized version, nor an attempt to please. It was a clean, honest, firm voice. For the first time in a long time, she slept soundly. And when she woke up, she felt no anguish. Only a light silence. The kind of silence that precedes true new beginnings. And there was much to come. Much more than she had been able to imagine while she was buried in her own choices. The fall, after all, had been the path to a more solid rise. And now, she was no longer running, she was walking. One step at a time. With clarity. With truth. And with the certainty that she would not go back to any place that would make her lose herself again. Years have passed since that afternoon when Jonathan and Helena walked in opposite directions in the park. Time has not erased the events, but has covered each scar with layers of meaning. The love that once united them has not been forgotten, but rather reinterpreted. They did not speak again after their brief reunion at the charity event, nor have there been any emotional setbacks or meetings driven by longing. The past, with all the pain and learning it brought, remained where it should have been, over. Jonathan continued on his path with admirable serenity. The pains of the past became baggage and no longer a burden. Alongside Camila, he built not only a new love story, but a shared life project that went beyond the walls of his home. With her, he opened a small foundation aimed at supporting young architects interested in social projects. It was the marriage of vocation and passion. Camila, with her sharp eye and entrepreneurial spirit, coordinated the strategic side of the initiative, while Jonathan took care of the technical details and the outreach to underprivileged communities. The couple gained notoriety for not only building physical spaces, but for rebuilding lives through hospitality and structure. On a rainy afternoon, they received a nationally recognized award. They went up on stage together, moved, and thanked everyone not for their success, but for the opportunity to transform stories. Jonathan, in his speech, did not mention names, but looked at the audience and said that in order to rebuild oneself, sometimes one must first fall apart completely. The audience gave him a standing ovation, but only he knew how much that phrase came from a deep place of pain and rebirth. Camila held his hand proudly, and there, beneath the flashes and smiles, there was peace. A peace built on hard truths, difficult choices, and a lot of healing silence. Helena, in turn, went through a long process of reinvention. The emotional scars left by her betrayal never completely disappeared, but they were no longer open wounds. After the chronicles published on the portal, she was invited to launch a book. She refused twice, insecure, afraid of turning her pain into merchandise. But after a sincere conversation with one of the victims welcomed by the NGO, she understood that telling her story was not self-promotion, it was a gesture of responsibility. The book was published under the title, Quando eu me traí, When I Betrayed Myself, and became an unexpected success. There was no sensationalism, nor empty justifications. It was raw, real, human. Thousands of readers wrote messages of identification, many of them women who saw themselves between the lines. The success did not make her proud. On the contrary, it made her even more cautious. She did not return to the corporate world, but became a reference in lectures on ethics, harassment and power relations. She was invited to contribute to internal policies of large companies, this time on the right side of history. At an international conference, at the end of one of her lectures, a woman came up on stage, full of emotion, and said into the microphone that she had left an abusive relationship thanks to Helena's words. The audience applauded, but Helena cried in silence. It was the first time she had cried in public since the end of everything. Because at that moment, she understood that she had managed to do something worthy with everything she had destroyed. She still lived alone, by choice. She never again got involved in a relationship with the same intensity as before. A few dates, a few attempts, but no involvement that made her stray from herself again. She found joy in the little things again, cooking for herself, reading until late, talking to women who just needed someone to say, "I made mistakes too, and yet I kept going." The former boss, on the other hand, fell into ostracism. After the allegations became public, he lost his position and contacts, and faced a painful process that culminated in his definitive dismissal. He tried to work in other markets, but his name was no longer welcome. He was abandoned by allies, ridiculed on social media, and exposed by other victims who finally had the courage to speak out. He tried to contact Helena once, by email. Not to apologize, but to share the burden of what they were going through. She didn't respond. She deleted the message and continued writing the next chapter of her life. Because she learned that there is pain that doesn't deserve an echo, and there are people who don't deserve answers. Jonathan and Helena never saw each other again. But occasionally, when they came across headlines or articles about each other, they would smile to themselves. Not out of longing, but out of understanding. They both knew that they had experienced something important, but that they had lost their way. They also knew that, although forgiveness does not erase the consequences, it can open the way for a more dignified new beginning. In one of his most recent interviews, when asked what he would do differently if he had the chance, Jonathan replied that perhaps he would have listened to himself sooner. And when asked about Helena, he simply said, "She did what she thought was love, but she forgot that true love never requires lies." Helena, during a live broadcast for an independent record label, was asked about Jonathan. After a brief pause, she replied that he was the man she loved the most and hurt the most. But he was also the one who taught her the most. She said she no longer blamed him, because she understood that she was the one who abandoned herself first. And that, for this reason, what she wishes most for any woman today is that she never has to lose herself so much to realize her worth. The live broadcast had thousands of views and became a reference in debates about emotional reconstruction and regret. And so, while Jonathan and Camila expanded their foundation to other cities and Helena finished the manuscript of her second book, the stories continued. None of them had a happy ending in the classic sense. But they all found meaning. Jonathan, the man who was betrayed, was now building spaces and relationships with integrity. Helena, the woman who betrayed, was now using her story to prevent others from falling into the same abysses. And in the end, perhaps this is the only possible redemption for such huge mistakes, the courage to transform them into a path, not a prison. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? Did you identify with any of the characters? What would you have done in their place? Your opinion is very important. We want to know what you felt after listening to the end. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and don't miss any of the next stories. Here, each episode brings an impact, a reflection and, above all, a warning. This story shows us how betrayal can destroy not only marriages, but also people's self-esteem, reputation, dreams, and even their future. It eats away at people from the inside out, destroys homes, undermines careers and leaves deep scars on everyone involved. Sometimes, the greatest loss is not for the person who was betrayed, but for the person who chose to betray and then has to deal with the echo of their own choices. The channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our commitment is to show, with truth and depth, how every choice has a price, and how the path of loyalty, although more difficult, is always the safest.